So we are back right there after that velvety smooth opening by me at the beginning right here.
And a little too much eggnog.
Yeah, a little bit too much eggnog. You know what? Every joke you guys can put is going to be fair after the lack of slickness of that. So I think for Beggar's Banquet, the best way to describe Beggar's Banquet is to give you an idea where the Stones are at this time in their career. And we covered Aftermath before, which was in 1966. And we're going to cover Let It Bleed, which is the last album of the Stones in 1969. So Beggar's Banquet is 1968, at the very end of 1968, December 6th, it was released.
The last album of the 60s for the Stones. Not the last album.
Right,
Wow.
The last album of the 60s. Oh, yeah, no, certainly not their last album.
They're still churning.
Yeah, they're still churning them out. But yes, it would be the last album of the 60s. And that album came out midway through 1969, so they actually had a quick turnaround time from this album to Let It Bleed. Some important things in terms of the context of when this album was released. This album was released after two albums that are notoriously, divisive, I guess I would say, amongst music critics, certainly, and even amongst the Stones fans. Before I go into both of them, let's see how good you guys are at your Stones trivia. Do you guys know either of the two albums, both of which that are not on Best Ever albums, that were released in between Aftermath and Beggar's Banquet?
I know one of them.
Okay, which was?
Their Satanic Majesty's Requiem for a Dream.
Request.
You are
right. That one, yes.
You are correct. That was the second of the two albums that was released.
And if I'm not mistaken, that was their response to Sgt. That was them trying to do Sgt. Pepper or something like that.
Sort of, yeah, sort of. That's kind of the rep it's gotten. It's a pretty fair description of it, but both of the albums, the other one was Between the Buttons, was the first one, and both of those albums represented and I don't know if you guys have ever heard those albums before. I'm very familiar with both. Both of those albums represent the Stones doing psychedelia and doing a lot of experimental music, and sort of the jury, especially on their Satanic Majesties, was, I don't know if this is really the Stones' cup of tea, it was, I think they're around all of these groups, many of the albums we've been covering, the Beatles, the Beach Boys, the Kinks, all taking these artistic chances. I think the Stones kind of went for it, and it was kind of like, I don't know. While Between the Buttons sold well, their Satanic Majesties was kind of the musical equivalent of a bust. So this album, as I'm sure you can tell just in listening to it, Beggar's Banquet is sort of looked at as a return to the Stones as a blues band, distinctly, and making a classic blues Stones album to their roots. It is also the beginning of the Stones moving into sort of that swagger, braggadocious blues, like sometimes people even say like sleazy honky-tonk version of the band that is going to sort of define the band in terms of their image for the next 20 to 30 years, but define the sound of the band for the next 10 years. So we're talking Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, Exile on Main Street, just all the albums that would follow in the next 10 years. This was sort of the beginning of that sound of the Stones. This album is well known as probably Keith Richards' peak in terms of his effect on the Stones' creation. He's often described as a jack of all trades and like the heart of this album. A lot of the songs were written around him laying down guitar parts, and some of that is because this was really the album, and we talked in Aftermath that it was starting to happen, but this was really the album where Brian Jones was MIA. And it would be the last album that Brian Jones played on. He contributed a couple parts to tracks on Let It Bleed, but unfortunately, by the time Let It Bleed had come out, he had passed away. And so this was the last album that he was alive for, but his role was greatly reduced. And this is sort of when the guitar sound of the Stones became definitively Keith Richards.
So I have a question about that, because I have a question about that, John, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
So because of that, because I know that he kind of started the Stones, right? Brian Jones, he was like the main guy, one of the main guys in the very beginning, and
Mm-hmm.
When he started taking, getting on the sidelines, was there like a lot of turmoil and arguments and stuff within the band, or was that something that he kind of just accepted? I mean, was there any?
No, he was very bitter about it, and It wasn't very long after he was no longer in the band that he passed away. It was, under 6 months from where it was. And, at that point, it was almost like Jones was kind of daring him to fire him a little bit. Like, he was just showing up occasionally, even sometimes for gigs. And he was kind of, say what you want about, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, but they were kind of known as being, when it was time to play, right? They were the ultimate professionals. And I think they carried that rep even, when they were touring in their Jurassic era, they still were known as like a very like professional outlet who knew how to put on a show, right? And so I think that his unreliability was really weighing on them. There's a story that kind of what led to it was like he would pass out in the recording studio and they'd sort of record tracks around him, and then there was a lot of like sort of passive aggressive comments directed his way by Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, who were annoyed by his unprofessionalism, but at times also a little bit jealous kind of the artistic credibility and sort of the business. We talked in the Aftermath album about he was sort of the business manager at a lot of times,
right.
along with Andrew Oldham, who was, by the way, was also gone by this point of the Stones' their
16-year-old manager.
Yes, they're 19, I believe it was. He had different stuff like that. But yeah, this was really a transition period for them because, Brian Jones is largely gone. Andrew Oldham's gone at this point. They returned back to like a blues rock and roots rock sound, but also started doing a lot of experimentation with instruments. I don't know if you guys noticed it, but like claves, like a bunch of different South Asian instruments are in this. Congas are in this, and we saw a little bit of that in Aftermath, but it stood out because it was just peppered in. This album has it all over the place, and I mean it comes right out of the gate in Sympathy for the Devil, which is a sound that doesn't sound a lot like Rolling Stones songs before it. So that's a little bit of context. This album very much led directly into the sound that you would hear on Let It Bleed, which we're going to talk about in about 3 more episodes. And I don't know if you caught it, but the CTS Instrument Hall of Fame, Mellotron is also on this, on both Stray Cat Blues and Jigsaw Puzzle. So that's in there as well. There's also, when Brian Jones is on this album, he's playing the sitar and the tanpura. And so if you heard the sitar, I'm sure you know which song the sitar is on. It's pretty well known, Street Fight Man, and the tanpura on No Expectations. So, I mean, he's on this album playing different instrumentation as well. So it's a very different type of album. And I think I'm going to kind of leave it there because, there's anecdotal stories about this, but really this was considered to be the Stones' return to form. And the critics, for the most part, felt strongly about this. It was well received in its time, and it has continued to be well received in its time, and it's well received both as an album and a return to form, and also as a foreshadower of what was to come, which would be probably 3 of the next 4 albums represent the Stones' sort of classic period of their most well regarded albums. So with that being said, let's move to Matt. Matt, what were your thoughts on Beggar's Banquet by the Rolling Stones?
So I'm glad we're covering this. It's one of the main Rolling Stones albums that I was not familiar with. When I was in college, I went through my Rolling Stones phase, and that was Sticky Fingers, Let It Bleed, and Exile on Main Street. Yeah. So, and this was just the missing link, and I had never bought the CD, had never really listened to it, but I knew that it was kind of in that same vein as those other albums. So I'm glad I got to listen to it, and I loved it. It's very. I definitely see what you're saying, John, in that it's the first kind of installment of that sound that they would eventually, go into in, the late 60s and early 70s, and the stuff that really is considered their best material. And it's very easy to see why here. I knew like the singles, I knew Sympathy for the Devil, I knew Street Fighting Man, and I knew Factory Girl. I'm not sure if that was a single or not, and I'm not sure exactly why I knew Factory Girl, but I did. But this is it's great. It's Rolling Stones, it's blues, and it's a lot of it's a lot of acoustic sounding blues. It's more stripped down. There's some country blues in here, and I really liked like the slide guitar. Dear Doctor might be my favorite song, I think, that of my unknown songs. That song was great. That is just like a really great blues country type song, and it's funny. It made me laugh. It's just, and then you've got classic songs like Sympathy for the Devil, which his vocal performance on that is fantastic too. I read somewhere that his vocals were almost like another percussion instrument, the way that he was inflecting and the tone of his voice, very much trying to get into the percussion of the song. There's nothing to dislike here. It's clear. John, I did listen to, because I did read a little bit about the albums preceding this, and I did listen to the Satanic Majesty's Request. Yes, yep. And I listened to it once. I did like it. I was a little buzzed when I listened to it. Maybe that helped. But I was like, this is pretty good, and I was kind of interested to go back to that. But I read somewhere that said, I think it might have been on Apple iTunes or something, that said that this album was kind of like a splash of cold water in your face.
Palate
compared,
cleanser. Yes.
And I could definitely see why this was something that the critics and the fans were very happy to get, because it's just great across the board. I don't have anything specific.
Did you catch Mick Jagger for the first time employing what he calls his country hick voice in Dear Doctor? Because he views Dear Doctor as the Stones writing a country song. Is how and
it sounds it. I mean, that's
and
definitely
a humorous country song. Is how
it's great.
It.
Yeah. He's where he marries I'm about to marry a bow-legged sow. And then
Stones always at the forefront of feminism. Yep.
And then she ends up leaving him for his cousin. So and that's funny too, because he takes on the voice of the woman that's leaving him, who writes the note. Salt of the Earth is like a great bar, singing like a good let's all get together and just drink to everybody, really, the hardworking people.
Now he was inspired by John Lennon on that song, because he had heard that John Lennon wanted to write a working class anthem, and so this was Jagger trying to write a working class anthem. So that was what Salt of the Earth was supposed to be. Yep.
Yeah. No, I don't have any.
That sleazy slide guitar I always love in Salt of the Earth too.
Yeah. I have no complaints about this. This is great stuff. This is, if you're not familiar with the Stones or don't get why they're great, just go to this album. I don't know how you can't like this.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel the same way. If you recall, I was kind of lukewarm to negative on Aftermath, and this is a real difference for me of what the Stones sounded like. This is what I expect and want them to sound like. It is a return to form, not having heard those previous two albums in between, but this is like what I want the Stones to be like. They sound more refined. They even sound more confident. They sound polished. The production is great on this album. I really love, like Matt, I didn't know this album outside of Sympathy for the Devil and Street Fighting Man as the big famous songs. The big discovery for me on this album was Stray Cat Blues. That song fucking rules, man. I love the bass line with the piano. Now, you said there's Mellotron in that. Maybe it's the Mellotron that's playing that I'm hearing. But yeah, that was a big... I'm going to put that song on repeat for a while, I think. I love how they get really down to the blues sound. That's throughout this entire album. I appreciate the country aspects that they infuse in it as well, like on No Expectations. That's kind of a slower, more country blues sounding song. I really like the piano on Jigsaw Puzzle as well. That was a great one. And Factory Girl, which I also loved, had the violin on that is really great, or fiddle, whatever is playing on that. And then in Salt of the Earth, I like in the chorus when everybody comes together to sing the chorus and all the instruments play at once, after being less sounding in the beforehand. That's great. Yeah, there's no real weak songs on this. There's a couple that I don't remember as well, like Prodigal Son. I don't remember too much what that sounds like, but everything else I really enjoyed listening to. And Yeah, I think this is a great starting point if you want to hear like the beginnings of the Stones peak period or ascendancy, however you want to phrase it.
I think too that you bring up a good point, Josh. The piano is a very prominent instrument throughout this album, and it's really
Nicky Hopkins. Yep, the Nicky
is that
Hopkins. Yep.
Yeah, it's and that's kind of the interesting thing with some of these songs. Like "Sympathy for the Devil" is a great example of that. That's a classic rock song. There's not a whole lot of guitar in that. You know, they have the guitar solo, but if you listen to the verses and the just the it's the bongo drums and it's the piano is the primary musical instruments, and I like that. I like that it's a in some ways they're using other instruments like the sitar, like the mellotron, but the album has a very stripped down sound to it. It doesn't sound like there's a whole lot going on, and it seems like there's just a couple instruments that are really prevailing the sound, that are really standing out as far as the sound goes. So I thought that was notable too, as well.
Yeah, the piano really lends itself to that honky-tonk feel that they're known for.
Yeah.
And I love that when those Stone songs that you can dance to, and those are abundant.
Can I give a slight different take on it? Because
Yeah.
I want to start by saying I like this album a lot. So I want to start by saying that. I do not like it as much as I liked Aftermath, though. And I will say that I have always viewed this Stones album, and I think I'm known as the Stones guy on the crew, right? So I say this not lightly. I always like my Stones when the albums have a clear edge to them. And I thought Aftermath was an album with tension. Like when you listen to that, the lyrics are angry. You can tell they're sort of struggling with their spot in the world a little bit. The variety of songs, I think of like Paint It Black and Stupid Girl Under My Thumb, even, as you get later, like Going Home and It's Not Easy, they're very different songs, right? Some worse than songs on this, some better, but it's a little more variety. I look at this as in the context of, and actually I like Between the Buttons, especially the US version of it. The US version is interesting because it packs on like Ruby Tuesday and Let's Spend the Night Together, which were singles, but they put them on to kind of beef it up, and those are two of my favorite Stone songs. And so I always like that. Their Satanic Majesties was very derivative for me, and I that album really I don't think needed to be made, especially there were already people scratching that itch, and I don't think the world needs the Stones to become a psychedelic band. So this was very welcome when you listen to their albums, in the sense that it's like, all right, they're back to doing what they do. And this is definitely one of Keith Richards' best albums. I love a lot of the guitar riffs. I love the drawn-out lyrics and the bluesy, as Josh mentioned, like honky-tonk sound. So there's a lot to like. I do think that the songs can get a little samey at times. And that's probably my biggest argument here. And I think a little bit of what hurts the album a little bit is I know what's to come. And they took this sound and made it sleazier and, raw. And like in the next 4 or 5, I mean, I think of like, certainly the 3 that we've talked about a lot, right off their bat, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, and Exile. But even like Goat's Head Soup and Some Girls that come later in the 70s, they have a little bit of that edge. And, I always think the Stones are at their best where they're like part sleazy, but in a seductive way. That's kind of what, that's where we talk about like, Mick Jagger can write a song that's like half misogynistic and half like modern feminist, in the same song. And that's kind of like always where I feel they're at their best. And so this album to me serves as a palate cleanser and a really easy listen, because it's a quick listen. 10 tracks, I think 27 minutes if I remember correctly. But in terms of if you
it's
want
more
to
than
hear,
that. It's
39 minutes.
Yeah, it's close to
39
40.
minutes. I'm sorry. So I apologize. I might have given it a little bit too much credit for being brief, but it seems like it flies by. But I don't know if it stands out to me as a picture of a band taking a leap forward. This is more a band reestablishing themselves before they take their next leap forward, as opposed to Aftermath, where that was a clear step forward in terms of lyrical content, how they played, the tightness, everything. And maybe that's just, you have to kind of walk them up through, the early Stones and see it, but that's kind of my take. So easy recommend for me, but I don't know if I'd go so far as to say that I like this better than Aftermath. I think Aftermath has an edge to the album that this doesn't quite get.
I think that's go ahead, Josh.
I was gonna say, yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it's necessarily a step forward, but it is like a refinement, or like you said, a return to form to that sound. When is the next leap? I don't know the Stones too well outside of their famous albums.
I would say the next album, Let It Bleed, is
Okay,
like, to
it's
me,
the
where they
next
take this formula and they add that quintessential, like, it's Mick being more Mick, like more showman Mick. Keith Richards, flexes a lot more of his guitar riffs and, play. It's kind of like they eventually, Josh, to give you an idea with context, and I apologize if people listening to this are not familiar with Stones, but the difference between the riffs they write on this album and like eventual riffs like they would write on, like, say, the song Bitch, right? There's no like huge riffs like that, right? There's stuff. Now there's ambitious songs, and I don't want to minimize at all, even though they've become standards. Songs like Street Fightin' Man, you know what I mean? Sympathy for the Devil. These are really lush, complex Stones songs, and they do represent a leap forward in terms of the complexity of their arrangement. So I really don't want to take that away. But I don't think you ever listen to the Stones for complex arrangements in many ways like you do the Beatles and stuff. You listen to the Stones to play like kick-ass blues rock that you want to listen to live. And on that front, this album delivers in spades.
I'd say I agree too with what you're saying. I didn't think about this either. The lack of edge compared to their other albums, and also the sameness quality. I think that's both of those points are valid. I think that if you like this type of stuff, though, it's okay. It's okay for an album to be samey if it's this good, and if you like the direction of what they're doing. And I'm also wondering, John, if you feel like maybe it's one of those things, and not just with this particular instance, but this is what we're talking about, is the fact that what's coming on down the line, or your familiarity with other albums and the fact that you like them better in and of itself put a knock against this album, because you're comparing it to others rather than being able to look at it as like a single kind of entity.
I don't know if it knocks it, because I still like this album a whole lot. And I would agree. I mean, what this album reinforces, by the way, is how influential the Stones were to a certain type of rock music. And I think sometimes that gets lost because narratives get created very easily, right? So, last week we talked about how the Kinks, fathered in sort of Britpop, right? And the British sound, and certainly everybody knows what the Beatles fathered in. And, there's been a run recently on, what the Beach Boys fathered in. But, when you listen to this Stones album, and then certainly the next couple as well, think about how many bands from the 70s and 80s and going on. I mean, when you listen to this album, the 70s, Aerosmith, the Eagles, I mean, my God, like they're directly derivative of this sound, right? If we go into like the 2000s, how often did this album sound like a Kings of Leon album? You know what I mean? In the sense that the Kings of Leon,
Crows,
Black Crows. There's just, and like when you listen to this album, you're like, yeah, what you realize is, and it's not that you necessarily realize it, just reinforces it. The Stones are the best blues rock band, arguably, that exists. And they're certainly the first one that was, really kicked you in, everybody integrated blues, but as a pure, like, if there's Blue-Eyed Soul, right? This is like Blue-Eyed, blues, right? That's what it is. And it just, that's like you said, it doesn't, even though it's samey, it's not samey as a bad word. It's samey and it gives you like a sound you want to hear, but that down the road they're able to take that and refine it to something else. So I don't know if it takes away from it, because I think that in my head, I rank this album exactly where it should be. A very good album that pretends really good albums. Kind of like, Matt, how you talked about Help with the Beatles. A really good album, but I think it fathers in stuff that I like down the road, right?
Yeah, and that's why I kind of threw that in there, because I think it's not just this example or just you, right? I think that that's an interesting way that anybody can look at an album or a band. It not just in a vacuum, right? You're looking at it a lot of times compared to their other work. And it's interesting how that, I think, sometimes can maybe make us like an album better or like a little less maybe than we ordinarily would if we had just if we just had the album in a vacuum, and I just think that that's an interesting thing. But obviously, certainly you like it, but it's also something that you're like, well, it's not Let It Bleed, right? So it's yeah, the opinion is
and-
changed a little bit because of that comparison to some
or
extent.
Sticky Fingers or X, you know what I mean? It's like, but it's there. It's just as important because it was a return to form that, and also you can't hear, you know, like a track like Sympathy for the Devil and not see how that leads itself into like Gimme Shelter on the next album, right?
Yeah.
And so like all of them are, and that's where, you know, we're kind of randomly jumping in on albums, and it's always easier to just go, okay, this album, and it leads to the next album. But can't you see, you can see where like Wild Horses on Sticky Fingers comes from, right? You can see where like Brown Sugar comes from. Like you can see what's coming, which is why this album is cool, because you see, in some ways you see, like I just talked about Brown Sugar or Bitch, right? To some degree, you can see what's coming on Sticky Fingers in Aftermath, because, you know, you can draw a line from, you know, Under My Thumb to, you know, the lyrical content and the swagger that comes especially on Sticky Fingers, which is about as aggressive as the Stones get, right? You know what I mean? And just like in your face, like, you know, alpha male. And, and that's the cool thing is they all come together. And I think that for me, it's hard to not reference all of the Stones albums. And unlike the Beatles, who we're going to talk about each of their stuff, you know, we're not covering the two albums between Aftermath this. We're doing none of the early Beatles, right? You know, in the 70s, we're not going to cover like Goat's Head Soup and, you know, Emotional Rescue and stuff like that. So there's going to be like little gaps where, you know, we're going between the big albums, but not seeing the artistic, you know, choices they make. And I think that's kind of, I think why I've harped on that a little bit, and why I stayed away from the bio this album, because, you know, we can do the bio on Let It Bleed when the Stones become, you know, a different band, you know, when they add Mick Taylor and, you know, Brian Jones is gone and they move into a different stage of their career, like touring rock band Stones.
Yeah. Hey, another question, just real quick. When it says, because I know Jagger and Richards write all their songs, is it pretty much a straight up Jagger does lyrics, Richards does music, or is it like equal? Like, do you have any idea of what the contribution is?
Jagger does lyrics unless they're doing a cover, and Richards writes the main guitar lines. Now, the rest of the band, you know, would write their parts at times, but in terms of, you know, the creation of the meat of the song, yeah, it's always, you know, Jagger and Richards, yeah. And there's never any anybody questioning that.
Simply having a wonderful Christmas time.
Sounds like the recording had a little bit too much eggnog, and we had some technical difficulties there. John was wrapping up, talking about the Stones.
Do you think that our clean feed, our recording mechanism here, just got sick of hearing from John and just kicked him out? Is that just what happened?
Maybe he didn't like our stance on the Stones.
Yeah. Maybe.
I love how Clean Feed is now a he. I guess there's imperial.
I personify
right there,
all technology in case of our future robot overlords. So I get in their good graces.
There you go. So we know Clean Feed he, so we'll have to figure out who the she is in terms of our technological
Is Anchor
platforms.
a she? Anchor can be a she.
Anchor can be a she. So there we go. So we're balanced.
It's like a ship.
Here's the good news. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's heavy. I guess the good news is we were basically at the end, and I'll sum up for everybody, I think, and I hope I don't speak out of turn, but I think everybody likes this album and thinks that you should listen to it as well. Is that a pretty good summary?
You're dead on. Yep.
All right. All right. So, yeah, during this holiday season, check out Beggars Banquet. And if you're particularly ambitious, feel free to go back in the catalogs and listen to both Their Satanic Majesties and Between the Buttons if you want the full Rolling Stones experience.